It was upon a raw evening in late October, when rain lay upon the panes of Baker Street, and the street lamps beyond burned as if smothered in gauze, that Mr. Sherlock Holmes permitted himself the rare indulgence of apparent idleness. Dr. Watson sat opposite him by the hearth, content to watch the coal light play upon his friend's keen features. Holmes, stretched upon the sofa, held a stick of sealing wax above a candle, letting softened drops fall with precise, almost scientific patience. He was in one of those moods of restrained restlessness which Watson had learned to dread and yet to welcome, for it was in such hours that cases most often came to him. His grey eyes were half closed, but now and again the lids lifted, and he would regard the flame with an intentness that suggested experiment rather than reverie. "You will burn yourself, or Holmes," Watson remarked, more to break the silence than from real alarm. Holmes smiled faintly. A man who fears a little heat had best not concern himself with the darker fires of human nature, said he. Besides, I am observing, a candle tells tales to those who know how to listen. Watson had time only to raise his brows at this singular saying when a sharp ring at the bell below announced a visitor. Mrs. Hudson's step sounded in the passage, and the door opened to admit Inspector Lestrade, his thin face drawn with fatigue. "Good evening, Mr. Holmes, Doctor. I've come straight from Clerkenwell. There's mischief there, and it's beyond common handling." Holmes rose at once. The languor fell from him like a cloak. "Clerkenwell," he repeated. "Narrow courts, prison walls, and the smell of tallow." Lestrade stared. "You've not been near it." "No, but you have." Holmes's gaze flicked into the inspector's cuffs, where a faint, greasy sheen caught the candlelight. "And you have walked through wet cobbles. Pray, proceed." "It's the shop of one Ezra Pender, Pender and Son, chandlers, near the old wall," Lestrade said. "At noon they found Pender in his back room, dead as stone, and not a mark on him. Door locked from the inside, windows barred, and his young assistant swears no one came or went." "No wound?" Watson asked. "Poison?" "That was our first notion," Lestrade answered. "But the chemist found nothing fit to swear upon, no arsenic, no laudanum. It's as if the man simply stopped." He hesitated, then added, "There's another thing, the candles, one set in particular." Holmes's fingers went to his chin. "Oh, show me." From his pocket, Lestrade produced a small object wrapped in paper. He unfolded it and set it upon the table. It was a short candle stub, ivory-coloured, with a wick trimmed neat as a soldier's moustache. At first glance it was common enough, yet something in its surface held Watson's eye, a faint spiral, as though the wax had been poured around an unseen thread. Holmes did not touch it. He bent low, his nose almost level with the wax. "Interesting," he murmured. "You see something, then?" Lestrade burst out. "My men say it's only candle." "It is a candle," said Holmes quietly, "and it is also a message." "A message?" Watson echoed. "To whom?" Holmes straightened. "Who found the body?" "The assistant, Tommy Rook, lad of 19, ran into the street shouting. Neighbours came. I was sent for." "And Mr. Pender's son?" "Arthur Pender is away in Birmingham on business, so the lad says. The old man lived above the shop alone." Holmes paced once. "Locked room, no demonstrable poison. A candle that is not what it seems." He glanced at Watson. "You notice the spiral. What do you infer?" Watson hesitated. "Some trick, some concealment." Holmes's lips curved. "So would I if I were in haste. But wax is docile. Heat makes it confess. Cold makes it hold its tongue." His hand drifted toward the candle on the mantel. "When a man who works in wax keeps a secret, he does not bury it in earth. He seals it where light may reveal and shadow conceal. Lestrade drew a breath. "Then you'll come?" "In 10 minutes. Holmes's voice had that quiet decisiveness which brooked no argument. "Bring no crowd to the shop. Leave your men in the street. Or if there is deception here, it will be delicate." Watson was already reaching for his coat. Outside, rain whispered against the glass, and the fog of London pressed close as a conspirator. Within, beside that modest taper, Holmes's mind had kindled, and Watson felt they stood at the threshold of a tragedy in which a man's livelihood and conscience were melted together, and the truth, like wax, must be forced into shape under the careful hand of the master. As they descended the familiar stair, Holmes paused at the landing, and with that whimsical attention which so often masks his deepest concentration, plucked the stub from the table and slipped it into a glass vial. "If Pender died by the agency of his own wares," he said,
Then we must treat every flame in that place as a witness, and every wick as a tongue that may be made to speak." Lestrade, hearing this, crossed himself hastily, and hurried into the mist. Clerkenwell received us with a chill that bit through wool and bone alike. The fog hung low over the crooked streets, clinging to the prison walls and the jutting signboards as though reluctant to quit that quarter of sombre industry. Pender and Son announced itself by a modest wooden placard upon which a painted taper guttered bravely against time and weather. A faint, sweet odour of tallow drifted even to the pavement. Lestrade dismissed his constable with a curt word, and we entered. The shop was narrow but deep, its shelves crowded with candles of every description, thick altar tapers, slender household sticks, travel candles in tin cases,
Sheehan curious novelties fashioned in the shapes of flowers and fruit. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, with the scent of wax and oil. At the rear a half-glazed door stood ajar, leading to the private room where the tragedy had occurred. Tommy Rook awaited us there, a pale youth with reddened eyes and hands stained faintly yellow at the fingertips. He wrung his cap as we approached. "Mr. Holmes?" he ventured. Holmes inclined his head. "You found your master?" "Yes, sir. Just past noon. I brought his ledger from the front, and he didn't answer. The door was locked. I thought he might have fainted, so I forced it with the poker." Holmes's glance flicked to the door. The lock was sturdy, but not new. The splintering about the jamb was recent and rough. "You are certain it was locked?" he asked. "I tried it twice, sir, and the key was in the keyhole inside." "Ah." Holmes passed into the room. It was modestly furnished, a desk with ledgers neatly stacked, a small grate where embers still glowed faintly, a high-backed chair, and against the wall a cabinet of drawers. Upon the desk stood a brass candlestick with a half-burned candle, its wax pooled and hardened in uneven ridges. Beside it lay a snuffer and a box of matches. The body of Ezra Pender had been removed, yet the impression of him remained. Watson could almost picture the old tradesman seated in his chair, head fallen slightly forward, as if in sleep. Holmes circled the desk without touching it. "He was found seated?" "Yes," Lestrade replied, as if he'd nodded off. "No sign of struggle." Holmes bent over the candlestick.
And this was burning. The lad says it was nearly spent when he broke in." Tommy nodded eagerly. "It'd run low, sir. I remember thinking he must have been at his accounts late." Holmes drew from his pocket the stub Lestrade had brought and set it beside the desk candle. Though similar in colour, the surfaces differed subtly. The spiral marking upon the stub was absent from this one. "Do you manufacture all upon the premises?" Holmes asked suddenly. "Yes, sir," Tommy answered. "Mr. Pender was proud of it. Said no one in London poured a truer taper." Holmes smiled faintly. "An admirable boast. And yet," He leaned close to the desk candle and sniffed. "Doctor?" Watson followed his example. The scent was faintly acrid beneath the sweetness, something sharper than common tallow. "You detect it?" Holmes murmured. I cannot name it." "Nor can I, yet." He straightened. "Inspector, you say no poison was discovered in the body?" "Nothing the chemist would swear to." "And no vial, no powder, no draught found in the room?" "Nothing." Holmes moved to the grate. Among the ashes lay several crumpled scraps of paper. With delicate fingers he extracted one and smoothed it upon the desk. It bore only figures, columns hastily struck through. "Accounts," Lestrade said. "All in order so far as we can see." Holmes's eyes travelled to the cabinet of drawers. He opened one at random. Within lay coils of wick, carefully wound. Another drawer held moulds of tin and wood. A third contained sealed packets of some fine white substance. "Tallow?" Watson suggested. Holmes slit one packet with his penknife and examined a pinch of the powder upon his glove. "Stearin?"
Perhaps, or something less innocent? Tommy shifted uneasily. "We use stearin for the better candles, sir. Makes them burn clean." "Indeed." Holmes replaced the packet and shut the drawer with precision. He turned abruptly to the youth. "When did your master last leave the shop?" "Yesterday afternoon, sir. He went to the counting house near Smithfield. Came back before dusk. He seemed troubled." "In what manner?" "He scolded me for miscounting a crate, though I was sure I hadn't. And he locked himself in here for near an hour." Holmes exchanged a swift glance with Lestrade. "Did he receive visitors?" "Only Mr. Hatherley." "Who is Mr. Hatherley?" "A supplier, sir. Provides wax from the docks." Lestrade nodded. "We've his name. Respectable enough." Holmes's gaze returned to the desk candle. "Tell me, O'Rourke, does your master ever prepare special commissions? Candles of peculiar composition?" The lad hesitated, colour draining from his face. He sometimes made private batches. Said certain clients required discretion." "Discretion," Holmes repeated softly. "And where are these batches kept?" "In the cellar, sir, in a locked chest." "Which key?" Tommy swallowed. "The key was always on his watch chain." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And the watch?" Lestrade answered. "Still in his pocket when we removed the body." "Then the chest remains locked?" "Yes." Holmes took up the desk candle at last, holding it against the lamplight. "Inspector, I must see that cellar." As we descended the narrow steps behind the shop, the air grew cooler and more pungent. Racks of drying candles lined the walls, pale ranks like a silent congregation. In the corner stood a stout wooden chest bound in iron. Lestrade produced the watch key and knelt. The lock yielded with a dull click. Within lay a dozen candles, each wrapped in plain paper. Holmes lifted one and peeled it back. There, unmistakable in the wax, ran the faint spiral Watson had observed earlier. Holmes did not speak at once. He weighed the candle in his hand, then glanced toward the ceiling, as if measuring distance and time in his mind. "A man dead in a locked room," he said quietly. "And yet the instrument of his death may have stood openly before him, burning in full view. Inspector, I begin to suspect that Mr. Pender's terrible secret was not written in ink, but poured, layer upon layer, into these very forms." Lestrade stared at the pale cylinders, and for the first time a flicker of uncertainty crossed his hardened features. The cellar seemed to close about us, and the ordered rows of candles took on a sinister aspect, as though each concealed a whisper of flame waiting only for breath to give it voice. Holmes replaced the spiral-marked candle in the chest with infinite care and closed the lid without permitting it to latch. His expression, which in moments of intellectual excitement would often assume a hawk-like sharpness, was now composed, yet intent, as though each faculty were marshalled in silent order. "Inspector," said he, "I must request that none of these be disturbed. We shall require 2 of them presently, one for experiment and one for comparison. For the moment, they remain precisely as we have found them." Lestrade, though visibly impatient, acquiesced. "Oh, you believe, then, that these are the key to it?" "I believe," Holmes replied, "that when a tradesman dies amidst the tools of his craft, one must consider whether his craft has turned upon him. The spiral is not decorative. It indicates a method of pouring, layer upon layer, around some central core." Watson regarded the candle thoughtfully. "A core? Of what nature?" "That," said Holmes, "is the question upon which a life may hinge." We ascended once more to the back room. Holmes requested a clean saucer, a small knife, and a spirit lamp. Tommy fetched them with trembling hands. The inspector watched with folded arms as Holmes selected one of the spiral candles from the chest and placed it upright in the saucer. "You observe," Holmes began, addressing us as though delivering a lecture, "seeing that the spiral suggests the wax has been wound about something not immediately visible. If we burn it, we risk destroying the evidence. If we cut it cold, we may miss what heat was intended to release." He trimmed the wick with the small knife and lit it. The flame burned steadily, its light clear and almost colourless. Holmes crouched so that his eyes were level with it. "At what hour was Mr. Pender last seen alive?" he asked, without looking up. 11:30, Lestrade answered. "A neighbour passed and saw him through the window, seated at his desk with a candle burning." "And the body was found at noon?" "Shortly after." Holmes nodded faintly. "Then if this candle burned in the same fashion, it would have stood near its end." The flame sank slowly, the wax softening and running in narrow rivulets down the sides. After some minutes, Holmes extinguished it abruptly with the snuffer, and while the wax remained pliant, took the knife and sliced cleanly through the softened column. Watson leaned forward. Within the pale wax, revealed by the cut, lay a slender thread of darker material, coiled in a delicate helix about the wick. It was no thicker than twine. "Good heavens," murmured Lestrade. Holmes extracted a fragment with his knife tip and held it close to the lamp. "Not twine," he said softly. "Paper, finely rolled and treated." "Paper?" Watson exclaimed. "Paper impregnated with some substance. Observe the faint crystalline residue upon its surface." He placed the fragment upon the saucer and touched it with the flame of the spirit lamp. A sharp, almost metallic odour rose at once, and Watson felt his throat tighten involuntarily. And Holmes withdrew it swiftly. "There is your poison, Inspector. Not mixed in the tallow, where any chemist might detect it, but concealed within a paper coil about the wick. As the candle burns, the heat reaches the treated paper. Vapour is released, subtle, invisible and deadly in sufficient quantity within a confined room." Lestrade's face paled. "Then the man poisoned himself by lighting his own candle?" "Not necessarily himself," Holmes corrected. "One must ask who prepared this candle and for what purpose." Tommy Rook had sunk into a chair. "Mr. Pender made special batches," he whispered, "but he never said—" Holmes's gaze fixed upon him. "You were aware of these spiral candles?" "I knew he locked some away. He said they were for private clients. I never saw inside the chest before today." "Did he ever burn one here?" "Not that I know, sir." Holmes turned to the candlestick upon the desk and examined its guttered remains. With a swift motion, he cut into it, as he had the other. This time there was no spiral core, only plain wax. Interesting, he murmured. You mean, said Lestrade slowly, that the candle he was found with was not one of these? Precisely. The desk candle is ordinary. Therefore, if he died by inhalation from a spiral candle, that candle is absent. A silence followed, heavy as the fog beyond the windows. Inspector, Holmes continued, was there any sign that a candle had been removed? Lestrade frowned. None that we remarked. The shop is full of them. Holmes began to pace. Consider the sequence. Pender possesses a stock of candles designed to emit a noxious vapour when burned to a certain point. He locks them in a chest. Yesterday he appears troubled. Today he is dead in a locked room with an ordinary candle upon his desk. Watson spoke cautiously. Could someone have entered, substituted the candle and departed, locking the door behind them? The key was within, Lestrade reminded him. Holmes's eyes flashed. Keys may be turned by more than one hand. Tell me, Inspector, does the back room window open? It is barred. Barred is not the same as sealed. Holmes crossed to the window and examined the iron rods. His fingers traced their fittings, then paused upon a minute scratch near one screw. Recently disturbed, he said quietly. Not forced, but unscrewed and replaced. Lestrade bent close. By heaven!
You're right. Holmes straightened, satisfaction glinting in his expression. Then we have not a suicide nor an accident, but a most deliberate contrivance, a spiral candle prepared in advance, a room made to appear secure, and a victim who, believing himself alone, lights a taper that becomes his executioner. He looked from one to the other of us. The question that remains, he concluded, is whether Mr. Pender was the intended target of his own invention, or whether the terrible secret he poured into wax was meant for another and recoiled upon its maker. Holmes's words lingered in the close air of the back room, and for several moments none of us spoke. The notion that a tradesman might fashion death with the same hands that moulded harmless light lent the place a sinister aspect.
And the rows of candles in the shop beyond seemed transformed from humble wares into a regiment of silent accomplices. Inspector, Holmes resumed at last, we must reconstruct the morning with precision. Rook, at what hour did you arrive? 8 o'clock, sir. Mr. Pender was already at his desk. He told me to mind the front and not disturb him. And you did not enter this room again until noon? No, sir. I heard him moving once or twice. The scrape of a chair, then nothing. Holmes nodded. Did any customer request a private interview? Tommy hesitated. A gentleman called about 10, tall, with a dark coat and gloves. He asked for Mr. Pender. I knocked here, and Mr. Pender came out and spoke with him in the shop. They talked low. The gentleman left after 5 minutes. Lestrade's pencil was already scratching. Name? I did not hear it. Old sir. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Describe him more closely. Clean-shaven, perhaps 40. Well-spoken. He had a faint scar near his left ear. Holmes exchanged a swift glance with me, but said nothing of his thought. After this interview, your master returned here? Yes, sir. He seemed agitated. He locked the door. Locked it from within? Yes. Holmes paced slowly to the window again. If the bars were unscrewed, it was done with care and time, not in broad daylight with a lad in the shop. Lestrade followed his reasoning. Then it must have been done earlier, perhaps the previous night. Just so, a man intending to employ this device would prepare his exit in advance. Holmes turned abruptly to the desk and examined the scattered account sheets once more. He selected one, bearing a series of figures that had been crossed through with unusual force. These entries, what are they? He asked. Tommy peered at the page. Deliveries, sir. Several crates sent to a Mr. Hatherley at the docks. Of ordinary stock? I believe so. Holmes tapped the page thoughtfully. "Inspector, we must interview this Mr. Hatherley without delay. Yet before we quit the premises there is another matter." He crossed to the cabinet and withdrew the drawer containing the sealed packets of white powder. Selecting one, he weighed it in his palm. "Stearin, you said?" he addressed the youth. "Yes, sir." Holmes opened the packet and poured a small measure upon the saucer. He compared it with the residue scraped from the spiral paper. "They are not identical," he observed quietly. "The packet contains common stearin, and the residue bears crystalline traces inconsistent with it. Therefore, the poison was not mixed in bulk with the material of the shop. It was introduced separately, most likely by soaking the paper coil before encasing it in wax." Watson considered this, which implies deliberation and knowledge. Indeed, the maker understood both chemistry and concealment. Such a method would escape cursory inspection. Lestrade's expression hardened. If Pender devised it, he could have supplied these to anyone with a grudge. Holmes inclined his head. Or he may have been coerced. We must not assume his guilt too readily. Tommy's voice trembled. Mr. Pender was strict, but he was no villain. Holmes regarded him with an unreadable expression. "Tell me, Rook, did your master ever speak of financial difficulty?" The youth's eyes flickered.
Business has been poor of late. Cheaper candles from the factories undercut him. He complained that certain debts pressed hard." "Debts to whom?" "I do not know, sir." Holmes closed the drawer and stepped back. "Inspector, we shall proceed thus. The chest and its contents remain sealed under your authority. A constable is to be posted discreetly. Rook is not to leave London. We shall call upon Mr. Hatherley at once." Lestrade agreed readily, and within minutes we were again upon the damp street. The fog had thickened, muffling the sounds of passing carts. Holmes walked rapidly, his head slightly bowed, hands clasped behind his back. "You suspect the visitor of 10 o'clock?" I ventured. "I suspect everyone, my dear Watson. Yet the scar by the left ear is suggestive."
"It is a detail one does not invent without cause. You recognize it?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Perhaps." We secured a cab and made for the docks, where warehouses loomed like grim sentinels beside the river. The counting house of Hatherley and Company stood adjacent to a row of barges laden with casks. Mr. Hatherley proved a stout man with watchful eyes and a complexion reddened by wind and liquor. He received us with ill-concealed irritation. "Pender?" he repeated when Lestrade stated our purpose. "I've had dealings with him, yes. Honest enough, if slow." "When did you last see him?" Holmes asked. "Yesterday morning. He delivered an invoice. Nothing unusual." Holmes studied him narrowly. "Did you commission any private batch from him?" Hatherley's gaze shifted almost imperceptibly. "Candles are candles."
"Aye, sir." "Not always," Holmes replied quietly. "Some are fashioned with more than light in mind." A pause ensued, charged and delicate. Hatherley's fingers tightened upon the edge of his desk. "I know nothing of that," he said at length. Holmes's eyes drifted to the man's left ear. There, half concealed by hair, lay a thin, pale scar. Holmes did not remark upon it. Instead, he inclined his head politely. "We shall not detain you further, for the present," he said. As we withdrew, I saw that peculiar brightness in his gaze which foretold the tightening of his net. Whatever secret had been poured into wax in Clerkenwell, its shadow now stretched to the river's edge, and the current of events was gathering force. Holmes did not speak until we were once more seated within the cab and rattling away from the docks.
Did the river fog pressed close against the windows, and the rhythmic clatter of hooves upon cobbles seemed to underscore the rapid workings of his mind. "You observed the scar, Watson?" he asked at length. I did. It matches the assistant's description precisely. Precisely. And yet Mr. Hatherley denied any unusual transaction with Pender. His denial was too ready, too absolute. A cautious man, when innocent, will qualify. He will hedge upon memory. Hatherley repudiated the notion outright. You believe him connected to the spiral candles? I believe he knows of them. Whether he commissioned them, or whether Pender devised them independently, remains to be seen. Lestrade leaned forward from the opposite seat. If Hatherley wanted Pender dead, he could have hired a thug and been done with it.
It's why this infernal contraption. Holmes steepled his fingers. Because a contrivance leaves no witness to swear against you, and, if properly executed, no poison for a chemist to discover. It is murder that masquerades as natural failure. And yet, I interjected, the ordinary candle upon the desk suggests substitution. The fatal spiral candle is missing. Just so, Watson. Therefore someone removed it after it had performed its office. Lestrade frowned. Through the window? Through the window, Holmes agreed. The bars were unscrewed beforehand. The murderer enters once the vapour has done its work, replaces the spiral candle with a common one, screws the bars anew, and departs. The door remains locked from within, an elegant illusion. The cab drew up before Baker Street, for Holmes had requested a brief return before further action.
Once within our sitting room, he immediately set about arranging his apparatus upon the table, retorts, glass tubes, and a small spirit burner. You intend further experiment? I asked. Indispensable. We must determine the exact nature of the vapour. If it is rare or costly, that will narrow our field. From his pocket he produced the fragment of treated paper and placed it within a small glass vessel. Applying gentle heat, he captured the fumes through a tube into a second chamber containing a solution. Watson watched with professional interest as Holmes observed the reaction. A faint precipitate formed. Remarkable, Holmes murmured. An alkaloid derivative, volatile when heated, yet subtle in effect. It would induce dizziness, then cardiac paralysis in a confined space. Not immediate, but certain. Is it commonly available? Lestrade asked. Not to the general public. It requires knowledge and access. Certain dockside warehouses import substances from the continent, chemical reagents, medicinal compounds. Hatherley's firm handles such cargo, Lestrade said slowly. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Indeed, his warehouses would afford opportunity. He extinguished the flame and turned sharply to the inspector. We must ascertain whether any quantity of such a substance has passed through Hatherley's books. Discreet inquiry, no accusation yet. Lestrade rose at once. I'll set my men upon it. When he had gone, Holmes sank into his chair, fingers tapping lightly upon the arm. There is still an inconsistency, he said. The missing candle? I suggested. More than that? If Hatherley or any confederate prepared the bars in advance, he must have had access to the room prior to the murder. Yet Rook claims no such intrusion. Unless it occurred at night. Precisely. We must learn whether Pender was alone in the shop the previous evening. Holmes rose again with sudden decision. Come, Watson, we return to Clerkenwell. The journey was swift, and we found Tommy Rook sweeping the shop floor in nervous agitation. Holmes questioned him closely regarding the preceding night. Mr. Pender dismissed me at 7, the lad said. He said he had work to finish. Did he commonly remain late? Sometimes, but last night he seemed anxious. He checked the locks twice. Holmes nodded thoughtfully. And no one else had a key to the back room? No, sir, only Mr.
Pender. Holmes's gaze drifted toward the stair leading upward. He lodged above? Yes. Show me his rooms. We ascended to a small chamber furnished with austere neatness. Upon the washstand lay a basin still faintly scented of soap. Holmes examined the towel, then the boots beside the bed. "Recently worn in damp," he observed. "He went out after dismissing you." Tommy stared. "I did not know that, sir." Holmes pointed to a thin crust of dried mud upon the soles. "Fresh, and not of this street. See the reddish tinge, dockside clay." I felt a quickening of pulse. Then Pender himself visited the docks last night. It would appear so. Holmes's expression grew grave. Perhaps to confront a client? Or a partner? He descended once more to the shop and stood silent amid the pale ranks of candles.
"If Pender went to Hatherley after hours," he said slowly, "and returned troubled, he may have resolved to end their association. A man who traffics in such devices might seek to withdraw. That could render him dangerous to one who profits by them." "You think he was silenced?" I said. "I think," Holmes replied, "that the terrible secret was shared between at least two men, and that one feared exposure." At that moment a constable entered hurriedly, hat in hand. "Inspector Lestrade sent me, sir. Word from the docks. A crate listed as special wax consignments has gone missing from Hatherley's warehouse this afternoon." Holmes's eyes flashed. "Missing or removed?" he asked quietly. "No one can say, sir. It was recorded this morning. By midday it had vanished." Holmes turned to me with that familiar electric intensity. "The game advances. Watson, either our suspect seeks to destroy evidence, or someone else has perceived the danger and moved first. We must reach those warehouses before night closes fully, for I suspect that within that missing crate lies the proof which will either condemn a murderer or reveal a conspiracy far wider than we have yet imagined." Within a quarter of an hour, we were again bound for the river, the urgency of Holmes's manner allowing no delay. Night had settled fully over London, and the fog, thickened by the damp breath of the Thames, rolled in sluggish folds between the lamps. The docks loomed ahead like a forest of masts and cranes, their outlines spectral against the murk. Inspector Lestrade awaited us at the entrance to Hatherley's principal warehouse, his thin figure rigid with impatience. "The place is locked," he reported.
Hatherley claims ignorance, says the crate must have been miscounted." Holmes cast a swift glance upward at the dark windows. "And the clerks?" "Dismissed at dusk. Only a watchman remains." Holmes requested admittance, and after some delay a reluctant porter admitted us into the cavernous interior. The air was heavy with salt, tar, and the faint odour of chemicals. Lanterns cast wavering circles of light upon stacked crates and barrels. "Which section housed the special consignments?" Holmes asked. Lestrade led us down a narrow aisle toward a cleared space where a chalk mark upon the floor indicated the missing crate's former position. "It was logged at 10 this morning," Lestrade said. "By noon it had vanished." Holmes crouched and examined the floor. The dust bore faint tracks, one set broad and square, another narrower,
With a slight outward turn of the left foot. "Two men," Holmes murmured. "One heavier than the other. They bore weight between them." "Removing the crate," Lestrade said, "precisely and recently." Holmes touched the dust and rubbed it between his fingers. "Still loose." He rose and followed the tracks toward a side door that opened upon the quay. Outside, the fog was denser still, muffling the lap of water against stone. Holmes bent low once more. "The impressions continue," he observed, "toward the river stairs." We descended to the narrow steps leading down to the water. At the foot lay the imprint of a crate corner in damp clay, and beside it the mark of a boat's keel. "Carried to a waiting vessel," Lestrade concluded. Holmes straightened slowly. "Inspector," Have any barges departed within the hour? A few.
Cargo bound upstream. Holmes turned sharply. Upstream? Toward the city? Yes. Holmes's expression grew intent. Then the evidence is not being destroyed, it is being moved. The question is by whom? A voice sounded behind us. By men who value discretion, Mr. Holmes. We wheeled. From the fog emerged Mr. Hatherley himself, cloak drawn tight about his shoulders, a lantern in hand. His face, illuminated from below, bore a curious mixture of defiance and apprehension. "You take a bold step, sir," Lestrade said sharply. "I came when I learned you were here," Hatherley replied. "I will not have my business slandered." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Then you will welcome clarity. A crate marked as special consignments has been removed from your warehouse. Who ordered its transfer?" "No one," Hatherley answered. "If it has been taken—"
It was stolen. Stolen by whom? I cannot say. Holmes's gaze flicked to the man's boots. Fresh clay clung to the soles, still moist. "You have been upon these steps tonight," Holmes observed quietly. Hatherley hesitated a fraction too long. "I inspect my property regularly." "At night? In this fog?" The man's jaw tightened. "I resent your insinuation." Holmes stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Mr. Hatherley, Ezra Pender is dead. The method of his death is known to me. It involves candles of peculiar construction, candles whose materials may have passed through your hands." For the briefest instant, the colour drained from Hatherley's face. "I know nothing of murder," he said hoarsely. Holmes did not press him further. Instead, he turned to Lestrade. "We must ascertain which barge departed most recently and its destination. Speed is essential." Lestrade dispatched a constable at once. While we waited, Holmes paced the quay with quick, measured steps. "Watson," he said in a low tone, "consider the sequence. A crate containing spiral candles is removed after news of Pender's death spreads. If Hatherley were the murderer, he would destroy such evidence, not transport it. Unless he feared a search of the warehouse. Perhaps. Yet the haste suggests panic rather than calculation." The constable returned, breathless. "A small barge left less than half an hour ago, sir, bound for Blackfriars, hired by 2 men matching the footprints." Holmes's eyes shone. "Then we are not too late." A police launch was procured with commendable speed, and within minutes we were cutting through the dark water, the engine's throb echoing against the embankments. The fog parted reluctantly before our lantern. As we approached Blackfriars, the outline of a barge lay moored beneath the shadow of the bridge. 2 figures moved upon its deck, bent over a crate. Holmes gripped Lestrade's arm. "There." Our launch drew alongside with a splash. Lestrade leapt first, followed by Holmes and myself. The 2 men upon the barge started violently. One was the narrow-footed accomplice whose track we had seen. The other, broader of build, turned toward us with a curse. "Stand fast!" Lestrade cried. The broader man made for the crate as if to heave it overboard, but Holmes sprang forward with unexpected agility and seized his arm. The lantern light fell upon his face. It was not Hatherley. Holmes's grip tightened. "Your name?" The man struggled, then sagged. "Griggs," he muttered.
"War warehouse clerk. And your companion?" "Doc Porter." Holmes released him slowly. "You removed the crate on whose authority?" Griggs cast a fearful glance toward the riverbank. "Mr. Pender's son, Arthur Pender. He said it must be taken at once, no questions." Lestrade stared. "The son? He was said to be in Birmingham." Griggs shook his head. "He returned this afternoon, met me at the warehouse, offered money to move the crate upriver." Holmes's expression altered subtly, as though a final piece had slid into place. "Then the terrible secret did not perish with Ezra Pender," he said softly. It has merely changed hands, and perhaps its intended victim as well. Lestrade lost no time in placing both men under arrest, though Holmes's attention was already fixed upon the crate itself. It stood half open upon the deck,
its lid hastily prized up. Within, wrapped in straw and paper, lay a regiment of spiral candles identical to those we had examined in Clerkenwell. Holmes lifted one and turned it slowly in the lantern light. "Untouched," he murmured. "They have not yet been destroyed." Arthur Pender's name hung between us like an accusation. I recalled Tommy Rook's assertion that the sun was in Birmingham and felt a chill that had little to do with the river air. "Inspector," Holmes said quietly, "we must find Arthur Pender without delay. If he has returned secretly and set this removal in motion, he has reason to fear what lies within this crate." Lestrade nodded. "We'll take these men to the yard. Word can be sent to apprehend the sun." Holmes, however, seemed dissatisfied. "Apprehension is insufficient. We must anticipate his next move. And consider, the father is dead by a method concealed within these candles. The son, upon learning of the death, acts at once to retrieve the remaining stock. Why? To suppress evidence or to complete what was begun." "You mean he may intend to use them?" I asked. Holmes's eyes met mine gravely. "It is a possibility we cannot ignore." We returned with our prisoners and the recovered crate to the dockside, where arrangements were made for secure transport. Hatherley, who had remained at a cautious distance, now approached with visible agitation. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "My clerk arrested like a common thief?" Holmes regarded him with measured composure. "Your clerk obeyed instructions from Arthur Pender. You may rest easy for the moment, Mr. Hatherley. Oh, the spiral candles are accounted for." A flicker, was it relief, passed over the man's features. "You knew of them," Holmes continued softly. Hatherley hesitated. "Pender approached me months ago. He spoke of a novelty, candles that burned with uncommon steadiness. I provided certain imported chemicals at his request. I did not inquire further." "Did you suspect their purpose?" "I suspected only that he was desperate. His business failed. He hinted at private commissions, lucrative ones." Holmes inclined his head. "And did his son share in these enterprises?" "I met the young man once. He seemed ambitious, impatient, with his father's caution." Holmes said nothing more, but I saw that his mind had seized upon this distinction. By the time we reached Baker Street, it was near midnight. Holmes declined rest, and instead arranged the spiral candles upon our table, examining each in turn with minute scrutiny. "Watson," he said at length, "observe this one." He handed me a candle whose spiral core appeared slightly thicker than the rest. "The paper within differs," he continued. "The winding is tighter, more recent manufacture, perhaps." "You think it prepared separately?" "Indeed. Most of these were likely fashioned earlier, in a consistent batch. This specimen, however, suggests later intervention. For what purpose? To ensure certainty?" Holmes cut into it and exposed the treated coil. He held it close to the lamp and frowned slightly. "The impregnation is heavier, the vapour would be stronger, more rapid in effect." I felt a tightening in my chest. "And then if such a candle were burned—" "The victim would succumb swiftly." Holmes rose and paced before the hearth. "If Arthur Pender retrieved these candles merely to conceal his father's secret, he might have destroyed them at once. Instead, he directed their removal to Blackfriars, closer to the heart of the city. That implies intention, not fear." "You suspect a target," I said. "Yes, and one connected to his father's dealings." At that moment, a hurried knock sounded below. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a breathless constable. "Inspector Lestrade sent word, sir. Arthur Pender has been located. He is at his father's shop in Clerkenwell." Holmes's expression hardened. "At the scene itself?" "Yes, sir. He arrived within the hour." Holmes seized his coat. "Come, Watson." The journey back seemed swifter still, urgency lending wings to the cab. The shop stood lit despite the hour, a solitary glow amid the fog. Within we found Lestrade confronting a young man whose resemblance to the deceased was unmistakable, yet sharpened by restless energy. Arthur Pender's eyes flashed as we entered. "I demand to know why my father's property is seized and my name dragged through the mud." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Your father's property includes candles of peculiar construction. You ordered their removal tonight." Arthur's jaw tightened. "I sought to protect my family's reputation." "By secreting evidence?" "There is no evidence of wrongdoing." Holmes stepped closer. "Your father died by inhaling vapor released from one of those spiral candles." Arthur paled, but his gaze did not falter. "Impossible." "On the contrary, the method is ingenious, and yet the candle burned in his room was replaced with an ordinary one. The bars were unscrewed. Someone entered after the vapor had done its work." Silence fell heavy. "You returned to London today?" Holmes continued. "Not from Birmingham, as reported, but from elsewhere. You went directly to Hatherley's warehouse." Arthur's composure wavered. "You cannot prove that." Holmes's voice grew softer, more penetrating. "Perhaps not yet, but I can prove that among the recovered candles is one prepared more recently than the rest. Stronger, more certain, a refinement upon the original design." Arthur's eyes flickered involuntarily toward the rear of the shop. Holmes followed the glance and smiled faintly. "Inspector," he said, "I believe we should examine the back room once more, for if I mistake not, the most dangerous candle of all has not yet left these premises." Arthur Pender's lips parted as if to protest, yet no sound emerged. Holmes did not wait for permission. With a slight inclination of his head to Lestrade, he passed through the half-glazed door into the back room where Ezra Pender had met his end. I followed close behind, acutely conscious of the charged silence that now enveloped the shop. The room bore the same austere aspect as before. The desk, the candlestick, the cabinet of drawers. Yet Holmes moved with a different purpose now, his gaze keen and unwavering. He went first to the grate and stirred the ashes gently with the poker. "Your father burned papers here yesterday," he remarked without turning. Arthur, who had followed reluctantly, replied with strained composure. He often destroyed drafts. Holmes extracted a fragment of partially charred paper and laid it upon the desk. Though much was blackened, a corner remained legible, a column of figures, and beneath them a name, Hatherley, followed by a sum crossed through violently. "An unsettled account?" Holmes murmured. "Or a severed partnership?" Arthur's hands clenched at his sides. "My father was entitled to settle his business as he saw fit." "Indeed, and perhaps he intended to do so." Holmes crossed to the cabinet and opened the drawer where we had earlier found the packets of stearine. He removed them one by one until the drawer lay bare. Then he tapped its base lightly. A hollow note answered. Without hesitation, Holmes drew his knife and prized up the thin wooden lining. Beneath lay a shallow compartment, cunningly concealed, and within it rested a single candle wrapped in plain paper. Arthur made a sudden movement, but Lestrade's hand fell upon his arm. Holmes unwrapped the candle with deliberate care. It was spiral-marked like the others, yet the wax bore a faint discoloration near its base. "The refinement," Holmes said softly. "Prepared separately, kept apart." Arthur's composure cracked. You have no right. Holmes held up a hand. On the contrary, Mr. Pender, this candle is the culmination of your father's terrible secret. He set it upright upon the desk but did not light it. Instead, he sliced into its side. The coil within was thicker still than that of the specimen we had examined in Baker Street, and the treated paper glistened faintly. Stronger, Holmes continued. More rapid in its effect. Intended for a confined space, perhaps a private office or counting house. Arthur's face had gone ashen. You cannot prove it was mine. Holmes regarded him steadily. Your father fashioned the original spiral candles, likely at the instigation of a client seeking a silent means of removing an adversary. He possessed the skill to conceal the poison within the wax. Yet something changed. He visited the docks last night, as evidenced by the clay upon his boots. He confronted Mr. Hatherley, perhaps over payment, perhaps over conscience. He returned, troubled. Arthur's breath came quickly now. Holmes continued, his voice low and relentless. You, meanwhile, were not in Birmingham. You had returned secretly aware of these dealings. When you learned of your father's intention to withdraw, or worse, and to expose the arrangement, you perceived both danger and opportunity. Lestrade tightened his grip upon Arthur's arm. The murder, Holmes went on, was executed using one of the earlier spiral candles. After the vapour had done its work, the culprit entered through the prepared window, replaced the fatal candle with an ordinary one, and departed. The remaining stock represented both evidence and potential leverage. You sought to secure it. Arthur's eyes flashed with desperate defiance. If I wished to destroy evidence, I would have burned it. Precisely, Holmes replied. But you did not wish to destroy it. You wished to control it. A silence followed, thick as the fog beyond the windows. You improved upon your father's design, Holmes said quietly, gesturing to the candle upon the desk. This specimen bears heavier impregnation.
You intended it for another victim. For whom? Lestrade demanded. Holmes's gaze shifted to Arthur's face. For Mr. Hatherley. Arthur started violently. You believed, Holmes continued, that Hatherley had cheated your father, perhaps withheld payment for previous commissions. With your father dead, you stood to inherit both the secret and the grievance. By removing the crate to Blackfriars, you positioned yourself nearer to Hatherley's offices, a private meeting, a demonstration of a superior candle, and the deed would be done. Arthur's composure shattered. He would have ruined us, he cried. He profited while my father bore the risk. When my father hesitated, Hatherley threatened exposure. It was he who suggested the candles first. Holmes's expression did not soften. Yet it was you who chose murder as remedy. Arthur sagged.
But the fight draining from him. I did not mean to kill my father, he whispered. I meant only to frighten him, to show him that Hatherley could be dealt with. But he lit the candle himself. He would not listen. Watson felt a chill pass through him. You left him in that room? I thought he would extinguish it, Arthur said hoarsely. I did not know the vapour would act so swiftly. Holmes's eyes were grave. You underestimated your own refinement. Lestrade stepped forward. Arthur Pender, I arrest you for the murder of your father. Arthur did not resist as the irons were placed upon his wrists. His gaze lingered upon the spiral candle, still standing upon the desk, its pale surface innocent in appearance. Holmes wrapped the candle once more in paper and handed it to the inspector. This, and the crate recovered at Blackfriars, will suffice. As we departed the shop, the single lamp within cast long shadows across the rows of ordinary candles, mute witnesses to a secret poured in wax and sealed with flame. The fog seemed lighter now, as though the night itself had relinquished its hold upon the truth, and I could not help but marvel at the inexorable logic by which my friend had drawn light from so dark a contrivance. The arrest of Arthur Pender did not bring with it the immediate sense of finality which so often attends the unmasking of a criminal. On the contrary, as Holmes and I returned to Baker Street in the small hours of the morning, I perceived in my friend a reserve of thought that signified unfinished business. "You are not satisfied," I ventured, as he stood before the hearth, absently turning the unlit pipe between his fingers. "Satisfaction? Well, my dear Watson, is a dangerous indulgence in matters of crime," he replied. "Arthur Pender is guilty, morally, if not yet fully in law. Yet there remains a question of origin." "You refer to Hatherley?" "Precisely. Arthur's confession, though illuminating, was shaped by desperation. He claims Hatherley first suggested the device. That assertion requires scrutiny." Holmes seated himself and steepled his long fingers. "Consider the father. Ezra Pender was a skilled craftsman, but no chemist of distinction. The alkaloid employed in the spiral candles is not one commonly encountered in a chandler's trade. It must have been supplied." "Hatherley imports chemicals," I said. "Just so, and he admitted providing certain reagents without inquiry."
A convenient blindness. I saw then that Holmes's mind was already advancing beyond the apparent resolution. At 10 o'clock the following morning we attended Scotland Yard, where Arthur Pender had been lodged. Lestrade received us in his office, his thin face betraying both triumph and perplexity. "The lad repeats his story," he said. "He insists Hatherley proposed the scheme months ago, claims his father resisted at first, then yielded under financial strain." "Has Hatherley been questioned?" Holmes asked. "He denies all knowledge of murder, says any chemicals supplied were legitimate." Holmes nodded. "Then we must confront him with more than assertion." Arthur was brought in under guard. His pallor had deepened, yet his gaze retained a defiant spark. "You have returned," he said to Holmes. "For clarity," Holmes replied calmly.
You state that Mr. Hatherley suggested the construction of the spiral candles." "He did. He said there were men in the docks whose removal would benefit certain interests." "Names?" Arthur hesitated. "None given." Holmes's eyes narrowed slightly. "And payment?" "Through invoices marked as special wax consignments." Holmes glanced at Lestrade. "Those invoices were found in Ezra Pender's ledger. The sums were crossed out recently." "Why?" "My father feared discovery," Arthur answered. "He wished to cease." "And you?" "I believed Hatherley would betray us to save himself." Holmes rose abruptly. "Inspector, we must examine Hatherley's warehouse accounts in detail, particularly the consignments corresponding to those invoices." Within the hour, we stood once more in Hatherley's counting-house. The man received us with ill-concealed irritation, but yet a flicker of unease betrayed him when Holmes requested access to his ledgers. "I have nothing to hide," he said stiffly. Holmes turned the pages with swift precision. Presently he paused. "These entries," he observed, tapping a column, "marked as chemical imports, yet no subsequent sale is recorded." "Stock on hand," Hatherley replied curtly. Holmes closed the ledger. "Then you will permit inspection of that stock." Hatherley hesitated, then signalled to a clerk. We were led to a rear storeroom where crates of various substances were stacked. Holmes moved among them with quiet concentration until he halted before a half-emptied chest. He removed a small jar and held it to the light. "The same alkaloid," he murmured. Hatherley's composure faltered. "It is lawful." "Lawful when declared and accounted for," Holmes corrected. Yet the quantities imported exceed those required for ordinary trade. They correspond precisely with the production of the spiral candles." Hatherley's face reddened. "You have no proof I ordered their use." Holmes stepped closer, his voice low but edged with steel. "You visited Pender yesterday morning. You pressed him, perhaps threatened him, regarding cessation of the arrangement. That evening he came to you at the docks. Words were exchanged. He resolved to withdraw." Hatherley's silence was answer enough. Holmes continued, relentless. "Arthur, aware of the tension, sought to assert control. He refined the candle, intending to remove you. In so doing, he tested the device upon his father, or, at the least, left it where it might be lit. The tragedy that followed was born of greed on one side and reckless ambition on the other." Hatherley's shoulders sagged imperceptibly. "I did not kill the old man," he said hoarsely. "No," Holmes agreed. "But you cultivated the soil in which his death took root." Lestrade stepped forward. "Mr. Hatherley, you will accompany us for further inquiry regarding conspiracy to commit murder." Hatherley made no resistance. As we emerged into the pale daylight of the dockside, Holmes drew a long breath. "Thus the chain is complete," he said quietly. "Ezra Pender, driven by debt, lent his skill to a vile enterprise. Hatherley supplied the means and motive. Arthur, inheriting both secret and grievance, turned the weapon upon its makers." "And the spiral candles?" I asked. "They will serve now as evidence rather than instruments," Holmes replied. "On that evening, seated once more by our fire, I could not help but reflect upon the strange perversity by which light itself had been harnessed to death." Holmes, perceiving my thoughts, smiled faintly. "A candle, Watson, is a humble thing, yet in the wrong hands, even the gentlest flame may conceal destruction. It is not the instrument that corrupts, but the intention poured within it." He rose, selected an ordinary taper from the mantel, and lit it. The flame burned steady and innocent, casting its warm glow about the room. "There," he said softly, "light restored to its proper office." And in that simple gesture lay both the resolution of the case and a quiet testament to the unyielding logic by which my friend had drawn truth from shadow. In the days that followed, the affair of the spiral candles ripened swiftly into formal charges. Arthur Pender's partial confession, reinforced by the physical evidence of the concealed alkaloid and the tampered window bars, left little room for doubt as to his agency in his father's death. Yet, as Holmes had anticipated, the matter did not rest solely upon the rash ambition of a son. Mr. Hatherley, confronted with the discrepancies in his ledgers and the unexplained surplus of imported chemicals, maintained a guarded silence for nearly 48 hours. It was only when informed that his warehouse clerk, Griggs, had provided a full statement regarding the removal of the crate that his composure finally fractured. Under sustained examination, he admitted to having encouraged Ezra Pender to experiment with novelty candles for certain unnamed clients along the docks, men who preferred solutions unaccompanied by witnesses. Holmes, when apprised of this development, merely inclined his head. "Predictable," he observed. "Conspiracy thrives upon the illusion of mutual advantage. When peril arises, each partner seeks to shed the other. Arthur, it emerged, had discovered the extent of his father's dealings only weeks before the tragedy. The son, possessed of sharper education and a more daring temperament, perceived in the invention both profit and leverage. He pressed his father to expand the enterprise. Ezra Pender, though complicit, appears to have recoiled from the full implications of what he had wrought. The crossing out of Hatherley's name in the ledger was no mere accounting adjustment. It was the mark of a man attempting to sever himself from a pact he had come to regret. Holmes reconstructed the fatal evening with that calm lucidity which never failed to impress even the most sceptical official. Arthur, having returned secretly to London, learned of his father's intention to withdraw from the arrangement and perhaps to expose Hatherley. Fearing ruin and craving control, he prepared one of the original spiral candles and placed it upon the desk under the guise of demonstration. He did not anticipate the potency of the vapour in so confined a space, nor the speed with which it would overcome an ageing man. When Ezra Pender succumbed, Arthur's panic supplanted calculation. He executed the prepared escape through the window, replaced the fatal taper with an ordinary one, and resolved thereafter to secure the remaining stock. His subsequent refinement of the design, evident in the heavier impregnation of the concealed paper, spoke less of remorse than of reckless determination to wield the invention for his own ends. The trial, when it came, was attended by considerable public curiosity. The notion that so commonplace an article as a candle could harbour invisible death captured the imagination of the press. Yet Holmes declined all overtures for public comment. "It is sufficient that justice proceeds," he said to me one morning as we perused the newspaper accounts. "Sensationalism obscures the lesson." "And what lesson do you derive?" I asked. "That secrecy compounded by avarice yields consequences beyond anticipation. Pender sought to light a profitable path through darkness, but instead he forged the means of his own destruction. Arthur Pender was convicted of manslaughter, the court acknowledging the absence of explicit intent to kill his father, yet condemning the reckless deployment of so deadly a device. Hatherley faced separate proceedings for conspiracy and unlawful trafficking in hazardous substances. The spiral candles, once instruments of silent murder, were displayed in the courtroom as mute testimony to ingenuity perverted. When at last the matter was concluded, Holmes returned to his accustomed pursuits with little outward sign of satisfaction. One evening, as the autumn air sharpened, and the lamps of Baker Street glowed steadily against the dusk, he sat with his violin resting idle across his knees. "You have written your account, Watson?" he inquired. I have set down the principal facts," I replied, "though I confess that no written page can fully convey the subtlety of your deductions." Holmes waved aside the compliment. The deductions were inevitable. The spiral marking upon the wax, the discrepancy in chemical residue, the clay upon the boots, each was a thread. It required only patience to weave them. "Yet without you," I said warmly, "those threads might have remained tangled." He smiled faintly. "Perhaps. Yet remember that it was not brilliance alone which resolved the affair, but attention. The smallest deviation, a spiral scarcely perceptible, proved decisive." He rose and crossed to the mantel, where a simple beeswax candle stood. Lighting it, he regarded the steady flame with reflective eyes. "There is comfort in such light," he said quietly. "It illuminates without deceit. Would that human intentions were so transparent." I could not help but feel that beneath his composed exterior there lingered a measure of melancholy, not for the criminal, nor even for the victim, but for the frailty that had led father and son alike into darkness. The case of the candlemaker's terrible secret thus passed into the annals of our shared experiences. It served as a sombre reminder that even the most ordinary objects may conceal extraordinary peril when guided by corrupted purpose, yet it also reaffirmed my abiding admiration for the singular mind that, amid fog and falsehood, could discern the faintest glimmer of truth. As for Holmes, he dismissed the matter with characteristic brevity. "A trivial variation upon known principles," he remarked, returning the violin to its place. "Come, Watson, there will be other puzzles, a less morbid, and perhaps more diverting." London never lacks for shadows, and where there are shadows there is always light to be found. With that philosophical reflection he turned once more to his papers, and I, watching the unwavering candle flame upon the mantel, felt anew that curious blend of awe and gratitude which his friendship so often inspired. It was some weeks after the trial that a final thread, long suspected by Holmes yet left deliberately unpulled, drew him once more into quiet reflection upon the affair. I had believed the matter concluded with Arthur Pender's conviction and Hatherley's impending sentence, yet Holmes had never entirely relinquished that faint, questioning look which signified some subtle reservation in his mind. The occasion arose upon a bleak November afternoon, when Lestrade called at Baker Street bearing a small parcel sealed in official paper. "We found this among Hatherley's private effects," the inspector announced. "It was concealed within a locked dispatch box. Thought you'd wish to see it." Holmes received the parcel with interest and unfolded it upon the table. Within lay several letters, closely written in a precise, slanting hand. He read them rapidly, his expression sharpening. "They are from one Calderby," he said. "A shipping magnate of dubious reputation. Note the language. Your luminous solution, our mutual inconvenience. And here, the demonstration proved satisfactory." Lestrade swore softly. "So there were other victims?" Holmes shook his head. "Not victims, I think, at least not yet. These letters predate Pender's death by nearly a year, and they reveal that the spiral candle was conceived not merely as a weapon of desperation, but as a commodity, a service offered discreetly." He laid the letters down. "Hatherley was no passive supplier. He was architect of the enterprise." "And Pender?" I asked. "A craftsman ensnared. His financial distress rendered him susceptible, yet the crossing out of accounts in his ledger, the burned drafts in his grate, these suggest a conscience at war with avarice." Holmes leaned back, fingers steepled. "Arthur's tragedy was twofold. He inherited both the secret and the resentment, but not the restraint. When he refined the candle, he imagined himself master of a perfect instrument. He failed to comprehend that such devices obey no loyalty." Lestrade regarded him thoughtfully. Or will these letters alter the charge?" "They may deepen Hatherley's culpability," Holmes replied. "But they will not alter the essential truth, that greed forged the weapon, and impatience discharged it." When the inspector had departed, Holmes remained silent for some time. At length he rose and crossed to the cabinet where, among other case relics, he had retained a single spiral candle, rendered inert by the careful removal of its poisonous core. "You keep it?" I said in surprise. "As a reminder," he answered. He set it upon the mantel beside an ordinary taper and regarded the two in juxtaposition, outwardly indistinguishable, yet inwardly opposed. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly. The spiral marking was the first anomaly, subtle, easily dismissed. Yet from that faint deviation unfolded the entire narrative: concealed alkaloid, imported reagents, dockside conspiracy, filial ambition. "And the unscrewed window bars," I added. "Precisely. Every effect requires its cause. The locked room was never a miracle, merely a misdirection." He lit the ordinary candle and allowed its steady glow to fill the room. The spiral one he left untouched. "In the end," Holmes continued, "the secret was terrible not because of its ingenuity, but because of its banality. Men sought advantage, they found instead ruin." I reflected upon Ezra Pender, bent over his desk in troubled calculation, upon Arthur, driven by pride and fear, upon Hatherley, cloaking calculation in respectability. Each had believed himself rational. Each had mistaken cunning for control. "You anticipated Arthur's intention before his confession," I said. "Awaited the heavier impregnation, the refined coil." Holmes smiled faintly. A craftsman improves his design, that is natural, but improvement implies continuation. Had Arthur merely sought to destroy evidence, he would not have modified the formula. The enhanced specimen betrayed his purpose. And the clay upon Ezra's boots? A silent witness to his nocturnal visit. Without it, we might have overlooked the confrontation at the docks. Holmes took up the inert spiral candle and weighed it in his hand. There is a certain irony, he mused. Light, symbol of clarity, was here converted into an agent of obscurity. Vapour without odour, flame without suspicion. He returned the candle to the cabinet and closed the door with quiet finality. "Will you record the supplementary letters?" he asked. "Certainly," I replied. "They complete the moral contour of the affair." Holmes nodded. "Do so without embellishment. The facts suffice." Outside, the London fog pressed once more against the windows, yet within our rooms the lamplight shone clear and unwavering. Holmes resumed his seat, selecting his violin at last and drawing from it a low, contemplative air. As I listened, I could not help but consider how often in our adventures the smallest irregularity, a footprint in damp clay, a scratch upon iron, a spiral in wax, had illuminated crimes of elaborate construction. It was this faculty of perceiving the faintest divergence from the ordinary that rendered my friend unrivalled. When the final note faded, Holmes lowered the bow and regarded me with that half-amused expression I knew so well. "A case concluded, Watson," he said. "Another shadow dispelled."
Now pray keep the spiral candle in your notes. It may remind future readers that evil seldom announces itself boldly. More often, it is wound quietly, layer upon layer, until heat reveals its true nature. With that he extinguished the lamp, leaving only the gentle glow of the hearth, and thus ended the singular affair of the candlemaker's terrible secret.